Okay. Uh, why are we talking about all of these things in regard to human experience? Of course, we already answered that question. Part of it is because human experience is something that we are most familiar with. But even the most familiar thing in life is not always easy to understand. It's not always intelligible because there are so many layers, in a sense, of tradition that have become part of human experience. Some of them we consciously advert to, some of the customs, some of the traditions, some of the practices, and even some of the values that we live by. They're almost like second nature to us. But unless we really pay attention to them in a conscious way, unless we become consciously aware of these things, many times we just make our judgment, or we pronounce an opinion on a particular matter, assuming that people understand where we're coming from, assuming that they would understand our background, our culture. Okay, so when you say, I am an Asian, and generally we say, well, if you come from Asia, then you should be able to understand the Asian, except that in Asia there's so many different cultures, and sometimes very, very different cultures, that we need to advert to it rather consciously in order for us to make a distinction between, let's say, South Asian or Southeast Asian, or Asian in the sense of in the North, China, Japan, and Korea, or even a little more towards the Central Asia. Speak about what is this, India, and well, the these big and small countries that form part of actually the what we call the Near East. The Afghanistan, for example. I don't know if how many of you are aware that Afghanistan is part of Asia, but Afghanistan is very close to Iran and Iraq, which are also still part of Asia. But all too often we speak of them as other than Asian. Asian, we would speak about something that is closer to Chinese, something closer to Japanese, Korean, or Indian. That's our general idea of an Asian. And so when we start talking about human experience, what we assume as a universal experience is not really very universal because they differ from place to place and from culture to culture. And so we discussed yesterday about what culture is, kind of a system that we have inherited from the past and from our forefathers, a system of beliefs, of values, of customs, and of institutions that precisely express these beliefs, values, and customs. But they are there precisely to give us a kind of an identity. It brings us all together as one people. It gives us, because of that, it gives us our own proper identity, a proper dignity, and then it is in within that, in the context of that particular culture, that we find security and we are able to aspire for something continuous. In other words, for continuity. Okay. So we have already said that in our culture, we have all of these things, beliefs about God, reality, ultimate meaning, about values, and about customs, and institutions, and especially institutions. We know that many of our institutions are probably things that we have taken for granted. For example, the form of government that we have, until we come face to face with another culture that is different institutional framework or institutional structure. So when we who have lived, for example, in a democratic society, when we come across people coming from China and they have a different kind of government, then we come to realize that it is not, after all, a democracy, after all, is not the universal, what do you call this, form of government or institution that is used in many different parts of the world by different types of people. Okay, so these are all part of what we consider as culture. We also say that culture is, in a way, humanizing our life. It makes it more human, it makes it more livable, it makes it more acceptable. It's something that belongs to us. So culture is something that really forms part of our humanity. Sedmak would say that our culture is an attempt to come to terms with life. There's so many questions in life, so many experiences, and so many difficulties that it is culture that, in a way, brings us to a kind of a realization of what this all means. So, for example, when you talk about the relationship, family relationships, we take for granted that in a family relationship, there's a father, there's a mother, and the children. But in another culture, especially nowadays, we talk about, you know, gay people of the same gender, of the same sex, but they're having a family. So the concept of family is somewhat altered, somewhat changed. But culture needs to be seen as something quite positive. According to the Second Vatican Council, in the document Gaudium et Spes, culture is a fact bearing on the very persons of human beings that they can come to an authentic and full humanity only through culture. And that is why we are very, very uh, careful about preserving our culture. When we come face to face with a different culture, for example, we travel abroad or we go abroad and immigrate in some other places, we are always very desirous of keeping who we are, our own cultural ways. We cook the same food in the same way. We probably dress in the old ways. And then our relationship is something that we treasure because that is the important focal point in our family. So we bring with us our own culture. In time, some of these things, some of our values, our customs, our institutions change precisely because the perhaps the dominant culture asks us to change or would require from us a kind of a modification or adaptation into the present culture. So wherever human life is involved, therefore, nature and culture are quite intimately connected. What Gaudium et Spes is trying to do is stress the positive element of culture. That is precisely what makes us different from one group of people to another. So different, but still, if we really come to terms with who we are as a human being, and especially with the differences in our culture, we would come to realize soon enough that we are united in some way or another. There is a common denominator that brings us together, that because of which we are able to work together, to live together. Okay. So in that sense, culture becomes a kind of a second nature. And when it is something cultural, you don't really think of it in a very conscious way. It just comes. It just flows from our own relationship. So that when you begin to speak your own local language or the language you were brought up in, when with somebody who comes maybe from your village or from your province or your state or your country, then it becomes something that is spontaneous. Automatically, you get into it. Whereas if it is something a different kind of a language, then you begin to be a little more precise, a little bit more careful, so that you don't what do you call this, make a mistake in using a language that is different from your own language. So our culture shapes our thinking, our acting, and provides models of perception. Okay. And it is true, the way we perceive things is more often than not culturally bound or culturally limited. So culture provides us with the worldview, how we look at things. And how does he define, how do we define culture, a worldview? Worldview is a central systematization of conceptions of reality to which the members of the culture assent, largely unconsciously, and from which stems their value system. So a worldview is like a perspective, but it is a culturally flavored perspective because it looks at the world from a particular vantage point. I don't know if you've ever come across an American, for example, but if you go to Europe, you will find that the Americans are very particular, are very noticeable. The Europeans can easily distinguish between an American and people from other countries because the Americans speak loud. They speak loud and they speak like they're very confident. And this is but that is precisely because they have a worldview of a nation that is number one in the world. So if you are belong to that kind of a nation, and of course you will be so confident because you are on top of the world. Now, with the COVID-19 crisis, of course, the US or America has not become the number one leader in trying to do something with this pandemic. In fact, they are lagging way, way behind so many other countries in dealing with COVID-19. So in that sense, their worldview, especially the worldview of their leaders at the moment, is somewhat limited or not as good as the worldview of other people. So the worldview is the source of both standards of judgment or of values, what is desirable, what is acceptable, and their contraries, as well as the standards of conduct concerning relations between individuals, between sexes and generations, with the community or outside of it. So, for example, if your worldview is, let's say, you are the number one power in the world, so you would assume so many things. For example, you would assume that uh, in other countries there would be toilets, there would be all kinds of facilities that you normally find in the US of A. But that is not so. That is not so because that is not always they're not always the same standards that other countries follow. They're not always, of course, in Europe, you could say that there is a kind of a homogeneity in terms of standards because they come from practically one kind of what do you call this long-standing tradition, and that is what we call the Western tradition, highly influenced by the Greco-Roman cultures, and of course with the development later on of the European culture in themselves. Okay, so this worldview enables us to make a pronouncement on a particular issue and would allow us to behave in a particular way. Now, the very good way of finding how this applies very well is in the United Nations. When you come to the United Nations, they would expect you to do this, that. For example, the president of your country is going to speak before the General Assembly of the United Nations. He has got to follow a certain protocol, and that is protocol of the United Nations. But that is not always the way you do things in your own country. For example, people from Africa will dress in their own what do you call this national costume when they come to the United Nations in New York. But sometimes it is a big sacrifice for them because it is very cold in New York in October or the last part of September. It's already cold. So if you go there with just a cotton shirt, you will feel you might get frozen. So you have to adjust your what do you call this your way of dressing. But even in the way you address to certain people, remember you're talking with people of more or less the same stature. If you are the president of your own country, and then you address the members of the General Assembly of the United Nations, you're probably addressing the presidents of other countries. Okay, but and there are many different ways of addressing the what do you call this the heads of state of different countries. And then so United Nations would come up with something like a general protocol so that you'll be able to. I remember when I was in, what do you call it, when I was in Africa, whenever somebody speaks, that person has to list down, or has to say all the names of the important people in the crowd, from the president, if the president is there, to the vice president, to the deputy, to the councilor, to the governor, etc. Because if you don't, according to their protocol, you are disrespecting that person and the authority of that person. And so you are not respectful enough, and you probably will not be listened to. But you can imagine able to take the first 5 minutes listing all, or reciting all the names of those people. They have found a way to cut it short by saying protocol, all protocols observed. That means everybody who have to be recognized are being recognized without even calling their names out. Okay, so that particular worldview influences our perspective. So when we talk about, for example, the British worldview, up until the time of the independence of India, the British what do you call this, empire, in a way ruled the world. Well, the Americans already at that time was ready to rule the world, but in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, it was Britain that ruled the world. So everybody was expected to speak English. Everybody was expected to go to follow the what do you call this, the the customs of the British, especially with respect to the Queen. And so you have a kind of a very standard British way of conducting things, like whether it's a ritual in the Cathedral of Westminster, or whether it's in another political atmosphere. There's some very strict rules that you need to follow. But that is, if we try to analyze it, you will find that many of them have been practices that go all the way back, not only to the very early days of England and the Great Britain, but also the practices in Greece and in Rome, because the British Empire had actually taken many of those practices that were already in vogue in the Greek Empire as well as in the Roman Empire. So many of the things that they had adopted were already what I call this, being practiced in some very earliest empires. For example, when we talk about democracy was not invented in what do you call this, England. It was something that was invented in Greece. Even before the time of Christ itself, democracy was already something that was quite common. Anyway, this worldview, as I said, offers us standards for judgment or values, whether this is wrong or this is acceptable, and the standards of conduct, whether we have to dress this or dress it in that way, we have to whether to bow our heads before somebody important, etc. So this worldview influences in a very, very deep way. What happened to? Okay. All right. Culture also, as I said, it's something that is almost second nature to us, because we have actually imbibed culture from when we were very young. We didn't have any choice, really, because the culture was imposed upon us by our parents, by our teachers. And our teachers were the ones who were precisely teaching us what is proper and what is not proper. And I don't know whether you still remember, when we were young, we were taught good manners and right conduct. I don't know whether when you were in grade school, whether you were still taught these good manners and right conduct, but that is basically learning into a culture. In the same way, also in the Catholic Church, when you what do you call this? When you enter the Catholic Church, you have to go through a certain ritual. You have to learn several prayers to be able to recite them. but also you have to also study the creed, the beliefs that we have, and the practices that we have. This is all part of inculturating ourselves into Christianity. Now, humans originally created culture by humans in a certain specific time and space. In other words, the the culture that we have, as I said, it was really a kind of uh, accumulation of many different practices. But who got them started? Of course, we're talking about the very early human beings who tried to start. For example, starting a fire. How did we ever get to start a fire now? Now we use matches to start a fire. How did the very early human beings start a fire? They have other ways. If you are a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout, you probably know how to start a fire by your what do you call this? By putting two sticks together and rubbing them, and then before you know it, you get a fire. Now, culture is meant to be something positive. It is meant to promote the well-being of people. It is not meant to what do you call this? To put down people or to make people less human. It is supposed to be a humanizing kind of an element. But there are cultures that eventually also become what is this out of what is the yeah okay uh, Matthew was out. Yeah, Matthew was out. That's why we needed to. Why are you coming in and out, in and out? Is it the connection? Is it the connection? You're coming in and out, in and out. It's a little bit difficult to continue. All right. Now, the new experiences that we have, of course, there are always some new experiences nowadays. So nowadays, there are many new experiences, but they are meant to contribute to the richness of a particular culture. They are meant to improve on what we already have in terms of culture. Sometimes they improve, other times they do not. And that's why many times some of the things that do not improve, they're usually set aside and replaced or ignored. But those that contribute to our well being, of course, is helpful and we keep them and we improve on them. Now, a point that we need to take is, especially here in the Philippines, the whole idea of culture, the interplay between culture and colonialism. Sometimes we speak about the native Filipino culture, but that is really something quite difficult to identify exactly unless you belong to a tribe. Excuse me, an indigenous tribe in the Philippines. You might be able to say this is our original culture, but for most of us, we have lived already in kind of a mixed culture, the culture that is derived from Spain. For 300 years or more than 300 years we were under the Spanish rule, and then for another almost 100 years under the Americans. Okay, so we have already what do you call this been we have been colonized, and so therefore part of colonization is the transmission or adaptation towards a different culture. Now, this only proves the fact that when we speak about culture, we speak about something that is dynamic, that is growing, that is always being absorbing things from different cultures and different languages, because that is a sign of the growing culture. It is not a static reality. It changes. It accepts new ideas, new customs, new habits, new ways of acting, etc., etc. Now, a culture that is pretty much in control of itself, especially cultures that have been formed after so many centuries of formation and reformation, such as you would find, for example, in Europe, the European cultures. They are all very, very careful in assimilating aspects from other culture. And it is very common for example, a Spanish to say, I'm not going to follow this because this is the way Americans do things. That's not our way. So, in other words, a culture that is resisting another culture. But sometimes, no matter how much we resist another culture, uh, when something happens, there's always something is going to be more. What is this? Uh, yeah. Yep. We are not able to. But out there. Okay. All right. Uh, all right. So I'm speaking about the one culture resisting another culture. Uh, but in most instances, however, some of the items from a say a given culture or a new culture are assimilated by the existing culture in a very subconscious way, in a very unconscious way. I don't know whether you realize it that English is something that is very common now all over the world. And why is it? It's because of the internet, because of the global network. And practically, the global network uses English. They can certainly have their own terms in Spanish, in French, in Italian, in other languages. But primarily, internet is in English. And so, in a way, we can say that the way English has penetrated different cultures is something that is quite astonishing because it just all of a sudden you just came to realize you are going to learn how to not only read English but understand English because some of the directions that you find in the internet are in English. Before you know it, you start learning English and you become more and more familiar with it, and it becomes something that you are so used to. Okay, so but other things, other aspects of culture, for example, needs a little bit more of discernment. For example, language. There are in European countries, for example, they have what they call this academy for every language. For example, the French Academy is the body that tries to preserve what is the French culture and the French language. As much as possible, they don't want to what it calls to import any language that would try to supplant some of the words that they have in French. So in other words, they try to translate into the French expressions that they have. Sometimes they are successful, other times they are not successful. But this is where discernment is very important. That's why a particular country, if it wants to preserve its own culture, has to have that kind of a body, kind of an academy that tries to guard uh, unwarranted incursions into the culture, into the language of the people. Otherwise, you end up after maybe 20, 30, 40 years, you no longer have that kind, your culture. You have lost it because you have been assimilated into a larger, perhaps global culture. Now, good for us to understand also that culture is good, but at the same time, there are also some negative effects in culture. Colonialism, for example, we say had some benefits. Part of the benefit that we have attained here in the Philippines in regard to the Spanish colonialism was that precisely we have the Christian faith. That's a positive thing. But the negative thing, of course, is that we have now imbibed different kinds of attitudes that are perhaps harmful to us. Excuse me. Because we are Asians, we are coming from a perspective which is more Asiatic rather than European. So, in a way, because we have adopted so much already of the Spanish, what do you call this, ways of doing things, we have, in a way, forgotten a little bit the Asiatic part or the Asian part of our culture. And in a very real way, that is really, what do you call this, uh, a very valid uh, commentary on the Filipino culture. The Oriental part or the Asiatic part of our culture is a little bit more hard to what do you call this, to decipher, especially now that we are all very much eager to be part of the English-speaking world. So there is a need to dig deep down on our own culture so as to establish a national identity, reestablish continuity, and reevaluate achievements or failures. Now, there was a time when people insisted we only speak Tagalog or we only speak what is this, the Filipino. They only have the, and that everything has to be translated into Filipino. Well, that was good to a certain extent, but we also have to realize that Filipino or Tagalog is not the only language, major language in the Philippines. We have other languages in the Philippines. And precisely those people who are calling for Filipino to be the national language, they are in a way imposing their own language on the rest of the people in the Philippines. There was a time when Bisaya or Cebuano was much more spoken than Tagalog itself, because there were more regions in the Philippines that speak Bisaya rather than Filipino. But now, of course, with the proliferation of media, the radio and the television, Tagalog or Filipino. By the way, the word in the Constitution is Filipino. F Filipino. Filipino would be Tagalog, but F Filipino is the national language, which is basically it's based on Filipino, based on the Tagalog, but already accepting all kinds of different words from other languages, major languages in the Philippines. It is an evolving language. It is not a language that is set already. It's an evolving language. So we need to be a little bit more patient because it is going to develop slowly. And who knows, we might have, Taglish could be part of the Filipino, what do you call this, vocabulary. All right, that's as far as culture in general is concerned. So we say culture is really something that is all embracing in regard to human experience. When we speak of human experience, the cultural framework is always important to take into consideration because very likely there is going to be the difference between one experience of a special group of people, of a particular group of people, and another experience of another particular group of people. So the experience of an Asian is different from an experience of what do you call this, a South American or a European or an American, precisely because the cultural context, the cultural framework, institutions, values, beliefs are different. So when we start talking about theology and theology coming from human experience, from the very start, we're already talking about something quite distinct one from the other. So it is very important for us to say, where is it coming from? In other words, not just in terms of the place itself, but in terms of culture. What is this typical culture that where he is immersed? But there is the context of his theologizing or doing theology. What is the cultural context? Now, part of human experience and even part of culture is our set of beliefs, as we already indicated earlier. So it has something to do with faith or with religion or with religiosity. This is what we're talking about. An aspect or a dimension of human experience is faith, religion, and religiosity. We will speak more about this, but in particular about the Judeo-Christian revelation in our next chapter. But here, what we're talking about is simply that human experience, which is on the level of faith, on the level of belief, on the level of our relationship with whoever we consider as divine or as God. Religion and faith arises from a sense of awe of life's mystery, of the mystery of life. We find life so mysterious that we don't know how to explain it. In very many instances, they explain it through a language that has to do with someone that is supernatural or something or someone who is divine. Okay. If you look at it from a very simple perspective, the perspective of human experience, faith in religion is an individual's reaction to social facts. In other words, here's an individual who is trying to examine what is going on in his in life. Why is he experiencing all kinds of difficulties? Sometimes he gets an answer for those difficulties or those questions. Other times he doesn't have an answer. In the end, he comes to a kind of a resolution and says, all of this is being allowed by God to happen in my own life. Then we ask the question, how did he jump from this human experience, the level of human experience, to the level where he invokes the name of God? This is something that we can say is always part of human experience. That other dimension, the dimension of life that is beyond human knowledge and human explanation or human intelligence. Anything that we cannot explain, either we we call it superstition, or it's the world of the spirit, or it's the world of religion, the world of faith, or the world of God. Okay, so but we need to understand that this experience is always in the context of a particular culture. So that when we talk about a particular religion, we will need to understand that that particular religion is embedded in a particular culture. So that a Christian religion presupposes a kind of a Christian culture. Uh, Buddhist culture presupposes a Buddhist religion presupposes a Buddhist culture. Okay, let's say a Confucian religion. I'm not sure if that is really a religion in terms of the Chinese. Is embedded in a Chinese culture, the Confucian culture. So that it is only we can only understand about this particular faith or this particular religion or this particular sense of the spiritual in the context of the culture itself. If you take it out of this particular context, you may be able to talk about God in a very general way, but it would lose its particularity. So when you talk about God as simply God that is a what do you call this absolute or universal, either you have a very rational God that everybody will be able to maybe understand, but or you have a God that is more very spiritual or very it's so unreachable that it's practically incomprehensible. So when we start talking about the Christian faith, for example, we know that our Christian faith is embedded in a very particular culture, which is the combination of the Judeo-Christian tradition, not just from the Jews, but also the Christian, what Christ had, started in this world 2,000 years ago. That's part of the Christian culture. So, uh, religion and revelation tells us something about our beliefs, our rights, and the practices that we have. And they are always directed towards what we call the society's ultimate concern. It's a concern for things that matter, things that endure, things that are eternal, things that are that will go beyond our own time. In other words, the basic question would be, uh, what is the experience? What is the meaning of life after we die? What happens to us? Normally, that question is answered by religion or by revelation. Now, revelation is more a particular way of experiencing religion. Revelation would be something that is something a kind of a contrast experience, an experience that is so out of the ordinary, out of the normal, out of the regular, because it is something that is uh, that we cannot explain, that we cannot even sometimes understand. But it is something that precisely makes us, what do you call this, believe in something deeper than ourselves. People ask you, why do you believe it? It's just that I believe. It's just what I believe. Some people would say, why do you believe? Because God has revealed himself to me. How? When I was reading the scriptures. Or somebody would say, I had a revelation. I had a kind of a mystical experience. At one point when I was praying, I was sort of levitated. I was brought up and I had a very out of the body kind of an experience. Some people call it revelation. Others call it sometimes, what do you call this? Hypnosis, or it could be other things. Now, that is of course the problem with the modern period, that anything that is not explainable, they normally would say it's something that is abnormal rather than the normal. But many cultures, in fact, all cultures, have something religious about them. There's always a religious dimension in this culture because religion involves the search for meaning on the burning questions of life. How did we come into this world? Where are we going? What is it that is going to make us happy? Why do we need to help other people? Or why do we need to invoke the name of God for this or for that? At the time of COVID, why do we have to pray? These are the important questions that we ask when we deal with religious issues. But we also have to understand that religion themselves, sometimes very positive, there are many positive things, but there are also what some people call the death dealing structures in religion. You know, like if you talk about the about Islam, okay, their whole idea of jihad or holy war, or declare a holy war. You know, some Muslims would say that is not part of Islam. That is just invented by some people. But others who are also very devout Muslims would say, yes, it is really part of what they call this of Islam. But this is where we need uh, to take a deep breath and perhaps start to ask very important questions. If this is a religion and if it's supposed to give us to furnish us with some meaning in regard to the very hard questions in life, if this is something that destroys life, jihad will destroy life, is it worth it? Or is it really something positive in religion? Of course, people who advocate jihad will say that we precisely advocate jihad because it is always a war against those people who do not believe, who do not believe, the infidels, the infidels, those who do not belong to our religion, they are infidels because they do not believe. Right away, you will realize that that is any religion does not discriminate against people who do not believe. If it is really a good religion, then it allows other people to be free to accept it or not to accept it. Okay, and here in our practice of Filipino Christianity, we find, of course, many different what we would call ambivalent structures or institutions in our Christian faith. On the one hand, we have so many practices that people from Europe will be able to identify as very European or very Roman. Of course, understandable because we were colonized by Spain. So many of our practices, religious practices, came from Spain and came from basically from Europe. But we have, in a way, transformed some of them into our own cultures. We have adapted, in fact, our own cultures into these practices. The cenaculo, for example, or the flagellation, the whole idea of the flagellation. Those are all practices that we can say have been traced to medieval Christianity in Spain, but at the same time there is a different kind of flavor to it that we have added in here in the Philippines. It's quite bloody in many ways. It's bloody and it's what they call this. It forms part of what we call panata. This is my what do you call this? My panata. This is my promise. I promise to do this during Holy Week, so I'm going to observe it, no matter if I'm almost going to be hospitalized at the end of it because of so much wound or so much injury. Okay. Also, the idea of the experience of nominal Christianity. What happens to us? We are a very Catholic country, but it looks like our Christianity is very nominal because let's say we are about 80 to 85% Catholics, but how many people go to church on a Sunday? You would be lucky to have 15 to 20% of the population going to church on a Sunday, even if our churches are filled. It's not all the Catholics are going to church. So is it a kind of a nominal Christianity? Okay. Or is it because of other things? Because of many other reasons. Maybe because of, we have taken it for granted and that that's not really. Or maybe because some people have found our own practices in the church, in the present church, are something that is really not adaptable to our own sensibilities, to our own culture. Maybe we need to do more enculturation. Okay. And of course, when we talk about religion, there's always this complaint that many people, especially some politicians, always level against Catholics, and especially the Catholic clergy, that there should be a separation between church and state. The priest should just, what do you call this, stick to the Bible, stick to religion, and let the state worry about the institutions, about human rights, about other things. Well, we already know that that is not such an easy, what do you call this, distinction. The distinction, in fact, of church and state, if you really want to know the origin of this distinction, it really is meant to protect, in fact, the church from the incursion of the state, so that the state does not favor one religion over other religions. It should be able to treat all religions equal. So in other words, it is not a way of stopping a religion from speaking out against abuses about corruption, for example, in government. But the idea of folk Catholicism, for example, is also another indication that no matter the discrepancies that we find in our own practices of our faith, there's always an attempt to make it more meaningful to us. Why is it that many here in the Philippines are very much beloved with processions, with some what do you call this, some outward celebrations, very external celebrations. They don't like things that are so quiet, or so meditative, so contemplative. They would like something more bonga, more what do you call this, lively, and that is because of, again, our own culture. Our own culture is basically what do you call this, fun-loving kind of a culture. So even when in terms of our religion, we would like to have fun. We would like to have a good time also. So folk Catholicism is part of the expression of our religion in the context of our own culture. Now, the other one, I'll go through this very quickly so that we get to understand. I will talk about the social analysis a little bit later. Part, again, of the culture that we have are institutions, both what we would call societal institutions and other types of institutions, like political institutions. social relationships. From the very start, when we were brought up into this world, when we were born into this world, we already are immersed in the web of social relationships, starting with our family. First, the nuclear family, father, mother, and then children. And then we move into the family of our uncles, our aunts, the first degree cousins, and then later on to the second degree, etc., etc. And then we go into the clan, then we go into the all kinds. That's a one way of what we call family relationship. Now, in tribal communities, such as we find, I'm sure, in Papua New Guinea, but also especially in Africa, the tribal communities have very, very strong societal relationships. That it is something that takes precedence over other type of relationship. In fact, it is something that is so dominant in some places. It has created some very, very difficult what do you call this, experiences in Africa. For example, the tribal mentality in some of the places in Africa is so strong that when a religious, an African who is a religious, let's say a Jesuit or what do you call it, a Dominican, etc., when he is appointed a superior, let's say a provincial or something like that, the tribe to which he belongs feel that they are entitled to use the facilities that their tribe man, who is not the superior, the provincial, has control over. So cars, houses, even money is so strong that that person who belongs to a particular tribe sometimes do not have a choice but to give in to the family. Otherwise, the tribe will disown him. They will disown him. And if the tribe disowns you, what will happen to your identity? What will happen to your network of relationships that you take for granted? Who will take care of you? Who will bury you? Etc. So you are, and that is something very, very strong in Africa. The idea of relationship with among kinsmen, among your relatives, you're very, very. So, for example, somebody in your clan or in your tribe is very successful. Let's say an engineer who has all kinds of contracts here and there from different what do you call this institutions or different corporations. When he gets a very good lucrative contract, many of the people in the tribe will depend on him for money, pocket money, and even for expenses for schooling. So I know, for example, somebody who was an engineer. This is really a first-hand experience. An engineer who had to send 30 of his nephews and nieces to school because he is the only one that is so successful in their group, their tribe, that everybody else would depend on him. Can you imagine? You're barely struggling to feed your family, but since you're successful, everybody else would depend on you, and you need to take care of it. If you don't do that, then you're ostracized. Then you are no longer considered as part of the community. And worse, they could even kill you. And they would kill it in the name of the tribe. Okay. So that is the kind of the depth of the social relationship in the in some societies, such that even in regard to the church will only be secondary compared to the family relationship. That's why they always say blood is thicker than the water of baptism. Blood is water than the water is thicker than the water of baptism. And this is both a problem, a big problem in the church. Sometimes it is helpful when you talk about projects for the church, for example. If they have no funds, it's the whole tribe that will come and help out. They will build the church. But there are also other consequences for it. But I just want to point out that this is kind of a societal relationships. What we, in contrast, what we find in the U.S., for example, by the time you are in high school, more or less you are semi-autonomous. In other words, you work already, you have a part-time job, and that more or less you have your own schedule, and the parents will respect you. By the time you finish high school, the parents will expect you to spend for yourself if you want to go to college. They will not pay for you. Well, of course, there are some parents who do that also. But in general, those people, the Americans, when they go to college, they have to pay for their own, they have to shoulder their own expenses. It's not, they cannot rely on the family. You are now an adult, you can earn a living, go find a way of earning something so that you're able to go to school. Very rich families, of course, they send their people to school by with the help of the scholarship from the father or the mother. But that is something that is exception. All right.